Dear students, welcome to the Indian Constitution virtual classes for 2020 and 21. So today let us discuss about the directive principles of state policy. Directive principles of state policy. The Constitution of India in its part 4 from Article 36 to 51 describes directive principles of state policy. This part contains a set of principles which are to guide future principles of the state. It is designed as a supplementary part to Part 3. It contains a list of socio-economic rights and freedoms which the state is expected to secure for the people through suitable legislative enactments. The directive principles of state policy constitute a manifesto for securing and strengthening the socio-economic foundations of the Indian democracy. They command the state and every one of its agencies to follow certain fundamental rules and principles while they frame their policies. Differences between directive principles and fundamental rights. These two parts, Part 3 and Part 4 of the Constitution, as such contain enforceable fundamental rights and non enforceable directive principles. The nature and content of each part is naturally different from the other. The fundamental differences between fundamental rights and directive principles are: first difference. Fundamental rights are negative injunctions, while directive principles are positive instructions. So, see how fundamental rights are negative, directive principles are positive. The first difference between the two is fundamental rights are in the nature of negative injunctions, which prohibit the state from doing certain things. But the directive principles constitute positive directions to the state to attain or to do certain things. For example, Article 15 of the Constitution states that the state shall not discriminate against any citizen on grounds only of religion, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them. Article 21 lays down that no person shall be deprived of his life or personal liberty. Against against this, the directive principles give positive instructions to the state to do certain things. For example, to organize village panchayats, to check concentration of wealth and resources, to introduce prohibition, to protect historical monuments, to promote international peace, etc. Second difference, fundamental rights are justiciable, directive principles are non justiciable. So, a major difference between the fundamental rights and directive principles is that Fundamental rights are justiciable, but directive principles are non justiciable. Article 32 gives to people the right to constitutional remedies, which guarantees the enjoyment of rights. The people can go to the courts for protecting their rights. The Supreme Court and High Courts have been given the powers to issue several writs for the enforcement of the rights. So we have already discussed about the five type of writs which gives protection to our rights and freedoms, like a habeas corpus, mandamus quo warranto, certiorari, injunction, etc. As against it, directive principles are not enforceable. Article 37 clearly states that the provisions contained in this part shall not be enforceable by any court. Third difference, fundamental rights provide for political democracy, whereas directive principles aims at socio-economic democracy. Fundamental rights grant and guarantee civil and political rights and freedoms, which are essential political pillars of a democratic system. The freedom of speech and expression, to form associations, the right to equality, the freedom of assembly, etc., all provide for the operationalization of a democratic system. But directive principles aims at the establishment of the socio-economic democratic system in India. Their aim is to secure the socio-economic foundations of the Indian political system through legislation by the state. Fourth difference, legal superiority of fundamental rights over the directive principles. Fundamental rights are enforceable. These stands granted and guaranteed. These have been given a priority as mentioned in the Constitution. As against these, directive principles are non enforceable principles which have been incorporated in the Constitution after the incorporation of fundamental rights. Fifth difference, fundamental rights have already been attained, but directive principles are yet to be attained. The Constitution grants and guarantees fundamental rights to the people. With the inauguration of the Constitution on 26th January 1950, the Part 3 containing the fundamental rights of the people became operative, and people get those constitutionally guaranteed and enforceable rights and freedoms. As against this, the directive principles are yet to be attained. Sixth difference, fundamental rights are backed by law, directive principles are backed by public opinion. The Constitution clearly vests the fundamental rights in a constitutional and legal basis and makes these enforceable by the courts. These are binding upon the state. As against this, the directive principles have been denied a legal basis by the Constitution. The directive principles enjoy widespread support of public opinion. Distinction between fundamental rights and directive principles. Fundamental rights, these have legal sanctions. They promote the welfare of the individual, hence, they are personal and individualistic. They do not require any legislations for their implementation, so they are automatically enforced. But on the other side, directive principles have moral and political sanctions. They promote the welfare of the community, hence, they are social, societarian, and socialistic. They require legislation for their implementation. They are not automatically enforced. Then, classification of directive principles. In Part 4 of the Constitution, so this part lists several directive principles from Article 36 to 51. For the sake of convenience, the scholars usually classify them into four main categories. They are socialistic principles, Gandhian principles, liberal principles, and general principles. Directive principles of state policy, socialist principles. So there are some articles mentioned here. So under these articles, all socialist principles are clearly explained. Then Gandhian principles, there are some articles 40, 43, 43b, 46, 47, 48 like that. So all these articles explains clearly the Gandhian principles. Then liberal principles. So these articles which are mentioned here are explained clearly uh, the liberal principles. Let us see what are the socialistic principles or socio-economic principles. This category includes those directive principles which aims at securing a welfare socialistic state in India. Most of the socialistic principles are contained in Articles 38, 39, 41, 42, and 43. The state shall try to secure the welfare of the people by securing a social order characterized by justice, social, economic, and political. The state shall provide adequate means of livelihood to all citizens, men as well as women, to secure equitable distribution of material resources of the community with a view to ensure common good, to operate the economic system in such a way as to prevent the concentration of wealth and means of production, to provide equal pay for equal work for both men and women, to protect the health and strength of the workers, men and women, to protect the children from entering avocations unsuited to their age or strength, to protect children and youth from exploitation and moral and material abandonment, to secure right to work, right to education, and a right to public assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, sickness, and disablement, and in other cases of undeserved wants, to make provisions for securing juries just and human conditions of work and for maternity relief, to secure to all the workers work, a living wage, conditions of work ensuring a decent standard of life, and full employment of leisure and social and cultural opportunities, to secure participation of workers in the management of industries. So, these are the important socialist principles. Then, second classification of directive principles, Gandhian principles. So, there are some principles which support the Gandhian ideologies, ideas, philosophy. So, some Gandhian principles are like this: to organize village panchayats and endow them with adequate powers and authority, to promote cottage industries on an individual and a cooperative basis in rural areas, to promote the educational and interests of the weaker sections of the people, and in particular of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and to protect them from social justice